German soldiers on the ground never forgot the first time it happened. A roar rose over the treetops, the kind that made your ribs vibrate before your ears even registered it. And then an RAF bomber tore across the field so low the men could see the pilot's goggles, the tension in his jaw, the shadow of his helmet as he flashed overhead. For a split second, it didn't feel like an aircraft at war. It felt like a wild animal scraping the earth as it hunted. It didn't make sense at first. Why would anyone fly that low, that fast, in a sky filled with flak, wires, towers, and ground fire, so close the shell casings practically bounced off the wings? Why bring a 300 miles per hour machine down to the height of treetops and trust your life to instinct and inches? The answer begins long before those German soldiers looked up. It starts in briefing rooms back in Britain, where pilots sat shoulder to shoulder, studying maps filled with symbols of searchlights, radar masts, anti-aircraft batteries, and night fighter patrol routes. And it starts with a grim truth every man in those rooms already understood. The higher you flew over Germany, the more likely you were to die. Radar would catch you first, then the searchlights, then the 88s, then the fighters. A whole sequence of death that the Germans had perfected by 1941, and Bomber Command knew it. Survival wasn't going to come from thicker armor or bigger guns. It was going to come from doing the one thing the Germans didn't expect, disappearing from the sky altogether. That's where low-level flying was born, not as a tactic, but as a necessity. Pilots trained for it in the countryside of Britain, skimming hedgerows, dodging church towers, roaring over farmland so low that farmers complained their cows stopped producing milk. RAF instructors kept shouting the same principle. The ground is your shield. Stay beneath the enemy's eyes. And it worked. Below 200 feet, the coastal radar stations struggled to separate aircraft from the clutter of land and sea. The radar waves bounced off the terrain, muddling the signal enough that operators couldn't tell if they were seeing a bomber or a hill. At night, searchlights swept right over low-flying aircraft without catching them. Flak guns overshot. Fighters flew patterns thousands of feet too high. This was the hidden truth pilots learned quickly. The sky was deadly. The ground was safer. As insane as it sounded. If you enjoy these kinds of deep, immersive World War II stories, the ones that put you inside the cockpit and show you what the pilots actually faced, it helps a lot if you subscribe. You'll find plenty more stories like this one. But let's stay in this one for now. The first real test of this new tactic came when the RAF was ordered to hit targets that seemed impossible. Heavily fortified docks, power stations, dams, U-boat pens, and Gestapo headquarters deep inside occupied territory. Targets that altitude could never reach accurately. Commanders didn't need theory anymore. They needed precision. And the only way to place a bomb exactly where it needed to be, on a lock gate, or a power plant's cooling tower, or a steel door, was to fly low enough to attack it like a knife instead of an arrow. Pilots began studying routes like surgeons. They memorized river bends, barn roofs, railway lines, fields, and even individual trees. They learned which villages would be awake at night, which valleys amplified engine noise, which hills created blind spots for radar. They practiced cutting throttle at the right moments, so their aircraft hugged the terrain like shadows. And then came the missions where the Germans really started to notice. A formation of Mosquitoes would skim across the French countryside at 50 feet, cross a town so low that people could see the pilot's scarf whipping around his neck, then accelerate straight toward a German HQ building and drop bombs that hit almost room for room. A Lancaster squadron would fly down a valley in Germany at rooftop height, engines echoing between the slopes, unseen by radar until they were almost on top of the target. A group of Blenheims would thunder across a Belgian field, so close that crops bent from the propeller wash. When German soldiers recovered from the shock of seeing aircraft that low, they reacted with the only emotion that made sense: fear. Because if the RAF was willing to fly that low, it meant they weren't just trying to hit targets. They were trying to break entire systems of defense. And that's exactly what they did. The sky over Europe changed the moment pilots learned how to read the land like a book. They stopped thinking in altitudes and started thinking in contours, hedgerows, church towers, river bends, and the faint scars of a country at war. Instead of climbing into the cold, dead safety of higher air, they learned how to hug the living, breathing earth. That meant flying through a world littered with dangers 1,000 feet below. Telegraph wires you couldn't see until the last second, stray stacks of timber, farm chimneys, the sudden spine of a ridge. It meant trusting the airplane and trusting instinct. It meant learning to feel the terrain under the wheels like a pilot learns the weight of his own hands. Training was brutal and specific. New pilots spent hours over England practicing approaches at rooftop height. They forced themselves to look past the front of the nose and read the landscape by peripheral vision. Instructors screamed corrections until their throats were raw. A mistake on these runs wasn't a drill. It was a lesson you lived with. Pilots learned to throttle back so the aircraft would settle into the valleys, then feed power to climb the sloping field and slip across a village roofline. They practiced cut-and-run techniques. Make one pass, deliver the payload, then dive and bank away before the dead weight of anti-aircraft response could find them. Navigation became a matter of micro-features. An L-shaped hedgerow, a ruined barn with a white roof, the angle of a road junction seen from the air. Those micro-features saved lives. Radio silence was absolute. No beacon, no chatter, just the wind in the cockpit and the pilot's eyes scanning the ground. At dawn and dusk, silhouettes were easier to make out, so missions often exploited that thin light where shadows and shapes became allies. Night low-level attacks. They were a different breed, black flights that moved like ghosts, finding gaps in dark valleys where radar simply couldn't see them. Missions born from this doctrine were surgical and terrifying. The dambusters, Lancasters flying low along valleys to drop a bomb that skipped over water, are the mythic example. Gyros, timing, and nerves of iron. For that raid, crews had to hit a precise altitude and release point. The bomb's whole effect depended on a perfect low-level run. The bouncing bomb was useless if the aircraft came in too high by a few dozen feet. Pilots flew at treetop level, measured by the ripple on the water beneath their planes, and trusted mechanical alarms and the feel of the machine to hold them steady. The payoff was devastating when it worked. Floodwaters tearing through dark, vital industrial valleys where the Germans least expected total chaos. Other missions were smaller, but just as dramatic. Prison walls that had been built to hold resistance fighters were little more than masonry if you could cut them with tons of ordnance at the right moment. Mosquitoes became the scalpel of the RAF. Fast, precise, and flown by men who liked to think of their aircraft as extensions of their own bodies. In operations like Amiens and Copenhagen, Mosquito crews slipped in low, above rooftops, across city parks, over spires, and struck with surgical accuracy. Those raids are designed to shock, to remove key enemy personnel, and to do so with minimal collateral, a near impossible brief that low-level precision could, at times, fulfill. The psychological effect on the ground was immediate. Soldiers who had never before seen a plane close enough to read a pilot's expression changed how they thought about the war. Aircraft that screamed low and fast bypassed the big defenses the home front had built around itself. Radar nests, searchlight grids, and coordinated flak barges that were tuned to higher threats. Instead of waiting for an incoming stream of bombers at altitude, German defenders had to look down and sideways and imagine the airspace beneath the radar. It created a new kind of terror, something that could not be tracked by instruments alone. Men on the ground felt exposed in a different way, as if the horizon had been peeled back and an enemy could now see into the private space between their home and their uniform. There were tactical ripples, too. Low-level strikes forced the Germans to reallocate resources. More infantry to guard vital installations. More light guns placed to cover low approaches. More nets and wire emplacements around potential landing strips. Every shift pulled strength from other parts of the defense. What started as a technique to survive the air war became an instrument for strategic attrition. The RAF didn't just hit things. They forced the enemy to rethink how they defended. Flying low wasn't only about avoiding radar and flak. It also allowed completely different mission profiles. Anti-shipping attacks in narrow channels, planting mines under the noses of inshore convoys, and precision attacks on infrastructure that required bombs to land within yards of a target. Fighter bombers like the Typhoon and the Mustang adapted to the doctrine by becoming effective close support machines. They rolled in at low altitude, strafed rolling columns, smashed transport, and left wreckage that clogged the arteries of supply. It was a brutal economy. One low-level sortie could destroy a supply train or a convoy and change the tempo of battle along an entire front. The pilots who executed these runs were often young, sometimes barely out of training, and they learned a kind of calm that the rest of the world couldn't appreciate. Calm came from muscle memory, from repeated exposure, from trusting your crew and your aircraft. It came from a knowledge that errors were punished instantly, but that the rules of the low-level game were rigid and therefore navigable. Pilots developed a superstition around certain call signs, certain pre-flight rituals, a routine of checking and double-checking every indicator. The cockpit chatter was minimal. Every extra word was a risk. Eyes were on the strip of land ahead, a line of focus so thin it excluded everything else. At the same time, the RAF's adoption of low-level tactics pushed innovation in aircraft design and equipment. Planes needed better armor in critical places, improved visibility at low angles, and stronger engines to cope with rapid power adjustments near the ground. Navigational aids, dead reckoning, timing by landmarks, and later more sophisticated systems were adapted for micronavigation. Engineers worked on gyro-stabilized altimeters, glare shields, and cockpit layouts that gave pilots an optimized view of the terrain. The machines evolved around the tactic, and that reciprocal development made the doctrine more and more effective. Not every mission succeeded. There were spectacular failures. Aircraft clipped by unseen wires, pilots skimmed into the crest of a hill at night, formations run into by surprised flak. Losses were high on some runs, and the price was paid in both men and metal. Yet the psychology of success fed more missions. When a squadron landed a series of dramatic hits with low-level runs, it became a magnet for more daring operations. Commanders started asking ambitiously, what else could this do? The list grew: railheads, munitions dumps, communications hubs, the occasional deeply buried industrial target, all of them susceptible to a properly flown, properly timed, low-altitude attack. The Germans tried to counter. They planted tall poles, strung wires, set up small-caliber automatic guns in likely approach corridors, and hid light anti-aircraft batteries behind hedgerows where low flyers might expect to spot nothing. They ordered soldiers to keep their heads down when aircraft screamed past, and to use camouflage patterns that broke up the outline of potential target buildings. But the fundamental problem remained. The defender must see the attacker to defend. Low-level operations reduced the defender's ability to detect and track by the instruments they trusted most. There were moments that became the stuff of legend because of how they crystallized the tactic's worth. A single Mosquito crew flying at treetop height through a valley scored hits on an ammunitions depot that had been impervious to higher altitude attacks. A small flight of Typhoons strafed and broke up a column of armored vehicles in a single pass, turning a logistical nightmare into scrap metal and fire. Engineers who watched the ground from low-flying planes could call out precise coordinates for demolition teams. Their observations allowed sabotage operations to be surgical, with minimal civilian damage. As the war progressed, low-flying became part of combined operations. Aircraft working in close concert with commando raids, with naval bombardments, with partisan groups on ground. A plane might mark a target by an approach so low it kicked up dust that partisan spotters could see and use to coordinate an ambush. Or aircraft would clear fields for landing craft by removing machine gun nests that could have prevented a seaborne assault. The whole theater of war started to think in linked, ground-hugging moves where air and land blurred into a single instrument. Beyond the tactical and technical, there was an unmistakable human element: the face-to-face contact with the enemy. When soldiers on the ground looked up and saw a pilot's goggles, they no longer envisioned faceless bombers overhead. They imagined an enemy man as frightened and determined as themselves. That moment of recognition eroded the myth of the invulnerable bomber or the impersonal machine. It added a bitter intimacy to war. Sometimes that intimacy broke enemy morale. Men who saw their adversaries up close began to feel more vulnerable. Other times it hardened resolve. If they're here, we'll be here, soldiers muttered, and dug in deeper. Strategically, that intimacy was a kind of power. People don't plan for things they cannot imagine. What they see shapes what they fear and what they prepare for. Low-level operations forced German planners to imagine new threats. They had to rearrange defenses in ways they hadn't considered, and to accept that instruments alone were not enough. That strategic shock reverberated through the Reich's planning rooms and into the allocation of resources at a time when those resources were already increasingly scarce. And, as the Allies learned and adapted, they developed a ruthless economy of force that maximized impact and reduced the scale of destruction by being precise. Instead of flattening whole neighborhoods from high altitude and accepting massive collateral damage, well-flown low-level attacks could punch a hole through the logistical heart of a region with relatively limited strikes. It was not always cleaner or kinder. War is rarely either. But it was efficient in a way that fit the logic of total war. The low-level doctrine also created heroes and reputations. Squadrons became known for particular types of raids. Mosquito crews as the ghostly night surgeons, Typhoon packs as the hammer of ground columns, Lancasters as the valley run specialists who could place a bomb on a crest and change the course of a river of supply. These reputations bred confidence, and confidence bred more daring missions. There was an inevitable cost. Fatigue piled up. Pilots who lived in that razor-edge life found sleep elusive. They came back from runs with eyes that wouldn't close because the mind replayed every hedge, every wire, every flicker of a silhouette. The physical effects were real. Jaw tension, blisters under gloves, constant noise that never left the ears. But they also learned a kind of professional contentment, the satisfaction of a run executed perfectly, the rare and private joy of a near-impossible approach that paid off and a target destroyed and comrades saved. By 1944 and 1945, low-level operations were woven into the Allied air campaign in Europe. They were less glamorous than the massed high-altitude raids with their dramatic footage and huge bomber streams, but they were every bit as important, often more so for the specific tactical objectives they accomplished. The Germans adapted, and so did the Allies, but the doctrine had already tilted the balance. It forced the enemy to expend men and guns where they could not easily be spared, and it allowed Allied forces to surgically shape the battlefield in ways that larger, clumsier methods could not. In the end, the face the Germans saw in the sky was more than a psychological shock. It was a symbol of an operational shift, the move from distance and attrition toward precision and audacity. Flying low meant accepting risk to by surprise. It meant trusting pilots to read the land and fly by feel. It meant losing fewer aircraft to radar-guided interception and more to immediate, local hazards. The choice was brutal, but the results were undeniable. The men who flew those missions left behind stories. The creak of a wing as it flexed under the strain of a low turn. The smell of a hedgerow passing too close. The gunner's shout that cut through the cockpit noise before impact. They also left a legacy in doctrine and in the air itself. Once you learned to use the earth as your armor, the rules of engagement changed. Defensive systems that had seemed invulnerable at altitude were suddenly incomplete. When the war ended, those pilots returned home with scars and medals and a quiet understanding that they had done something no one else had tried at scale. They had reshaped the logic of air attack. They had taken aircraft designed to conquer the sky and turned them into instruments of the land. Fast, surgical, and terrifyingly intimate. The Germans could see their faces not because the pilots sought attention, but because the pilots had to be close enough to the land to do what needed to be done. Up close, you could measure the humanity of the enemy and the limits of your own machines. Up close, in those fleeting seconds of recognition, the fundamental truth of low-level warfare revealed itself. Victory sometimes demands that you close the distance until the war is a matter of inches in breadth. Low-level flying changed the entire rhythm of a mission long before the aircraft ever left the runway. Crews approached briefings differently. Maps weren't just marked with target coordinates. They were covered in layers of terrain notes that mattered only at 50 feet. The shape of a valley floor, the angle of a ridge line, the location of a single radio mast that could snap a wing on impact. Pilots stared at these charts until they formed mental movies of the entire route. They didn't imagine the target first. They imagined the 1,000 small dangers on the way to it. Weather briefings became more psychological than meteorological. A gust of wind that meant almost nothing at 12,000 feet could kill a crew outright at low level. Fog that was merely annoying at altitude became a solid wall at 100 feet. And rain. Rain didn't just make visibility worse. It softened fields, made riverbanks slick, and changed the color of terrain so much that landmarks looked wrong. Pilots learned to trust patterns instead of appearances. A river that usually glinted silver might turn dull under cloud cover, making it easy to mistake it for a road. A forest could appear darker or lighter depending on the angle of the sun. Every shift mattered. The ground crews felt the difference too. They checked propellers for even the smallest nick. One tiny imperfection could turn into a vibration, and a vibration could throw a pilot off by inches, and inches mattered at low level. Fuel mixtures were tuned perfectly to avoid sputtering during sudden throttle changes. Guns were aligned specifically for the angles of low passes. Every bolt, every wire, every hydraulic line had to be flawless. And then there was the psychological preparation. Low-level missions were terrifying even for experienced crews. Pilots pretended they were calm. Navigators triple-checked their notes. Gunners paced behind the aircraft like boxers loosening their shoulders. There were rituals, small ones, tapping the fuselage before climbing the ladder, wearing a particular glove, folding a map the same way every time. None of it actually changed the odds, but made the nerves settle for a moment. When engines finally roared to life, airfields trembled. The smell of fuel and oil mixed with the morning air. Crews strapped into their seats, and the aircraft vibrated as if it already wanted to break free from the ground. Pilots checked every dial twice, testing flaps and trim, rehearsing climb-outs and evasive maneuvers they hoped they wouldn't need. Takeoff wasn't the hard part. It was what came next. At altitude, aircraft lined up into neat formations. At low level, formations dissolved almost immediately. The terrain forced each pilot to choose his own path through valleys, around hills, over hedgerows. A formation might start as a neat row of aircraft, but quickly stretch into a scattered line moving like a school of fish, each pilot close enough to help, but independent enough to avoid being caught by terrain. The first 10 minutes of a mission were usually the calmest. Britain rolled beneath the aircraft like a familiar map. Crews knew the towns and villages, the fields and rivers. But as they reached the coast, something changed. The sea ahead represented a threshold. Once they crossed it, radio silence became sacred. No more chatter, no more corrections, just the engines, the wind, and the navigator's taps on the mapboard. Crossing the channel at low level was a surreal experience. The water sometimes looked so close that pilots felt they could reach down and skim it with their fingertips. Flying low over the water came with its own dangers. The reflection of clouds could trick a pilot into thinking he had more altitude than he did. The texture of the sea changed with the wind. Calm water acted like a mirror. Choppy water made the world look like it was rising toward the aircraft. Pilots had to fix their eyes on a reference, usually a faint line on the horizon, and trust it. Then came the French coast. Low-level flyers often saw the cliffs and dunes long before any German defender spotted them. Radar struggled to separate their signatures from the clutter of landscape. Spotters scanning the horizon expected high bombers, not phantoms sliding beneath the searchlight beams. Sometimes the first warning the Germans had was the sound, a deep, pulsing growl that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the time they turned their heads, the aircraft were already past. On many missions, there was no flak at all for the first stretch. Low flyers were beneath the range of many guns. But once the Germans realized what was happening, everything changed. Light flak batteries opened up in narrow arcs. Tracers whipped across the fields as crews tried to judge the aircraft's path. Some pilots rolled their wings as if dancing between lines of fire. Others cut throttle to sink behind trees. Gunners aboard the aircraft fired back when they could, but most of the time it was speed and terrain that saved them, not firepower. German fighters were the real threat. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs patrolled at higher altitudes. Pilots trained to intercept high-level threats. But low-level attackers forced them into a game they didn't like, diving into valleys, threading between trees, risking their own wings clipping the ground. Some German pilots refused to follow. Others did and paid the price. A fighter diving too steeply into a valley could misjudge the angle and hit the ground before leveling off. Pilots called this chasing into the earth. Low-level bombers took advantage of this. They pulled maneuvers fighters weren't accustomed to, tight banks that forced pursuers to overshoot, sudden dives behind farmhouses, threading the aircraft through gaps in terrain that looked suicidal from the ground. Then came the approach to the target. At altitude, bombing was distant and abstract. At low level, it was intimate and violent. Crews could see the windows of buildings. They could see trucks parked outside. Sometimes they could see German soldiers scrambling in confusion. The aircraft bucked with every gust of wind and every pull of the controls. It wasn't a glide. It was a controlled plunge. Bombs weren't dropped. They were placed. Released at angles and speeds calculated to skip across water or punch through a wall or skid into a courtyard before detonating. Pilots watched trees blur past their wings. Navigators called out seconds remaining as if counting down the beat of a heart. Bomb aimers steadied themselves against the motion, keeping their eyes locked on the target, even as the world shook around them. When the bombs released, the aircraft instantly felt lighter. Pilots pulled back, engines screamed, and the whole machine clawed upward just enough to clear a tower or tree line. Sometimes not enough. Some missions clipped rooftops, scraped antennas, or tore through leaves. The crews barely noticed until they returned to base and found branches stuck in landing gear. Escape was often harder than approach. By then, every German in the area was alert. Flak erupted behind them. Fighters scrambled. Roads filled with troops firing rifles into the sky. But the aircraft moved like animals freed from constraints, darting low, blending into the terrain, trusting speed more than altitude. And then came the flight home. Silence again. Relief mixed with the tension that still clung to muscles. Some crews laughed in shaky bursts. Others said nothing. They flew across the channel feeling older than when they had left. Britain came into view. Fields, villages, towns. Home. Landing after a low-level strike felt surreal. Crews stepped out of their aircraft and often kissed the ground without irony. Legs shook. Faces were pale, but eyes were alive. They had survived something that felt both insane and necessary. They had placed bombs where they were needed, not where wind, altitude, or radar dictated. They had turned the land itself into armor. And slowly, mission after mission, the Germans adapted. New defenses were built. More light guns positioned near key targets. Radar networks expanded. But the RAF kept pushing. Lower, faster, more precise. They didn't just change the altitude of war. They changed the entire language of it. Flying low reshaped everything about how war felt from the cockpit. It forced pilots to merge with the land in a way no training manual could fully teach. On some missions, crews returned with grass stains on their wings. Actual blades of grass wedged between metal seams. Proof they had dipped into a valley so tight the aircraft had scraped the ground. Mechanics kept those blades as souvenirs, shaking their heads in disbelief. One ground crew in 1943 found a splintered rooftop tile stuck to the leading edge of a Mosquitoes wing. The pilot admitted he hadn't even noticed hitting it. Stories like that weren't exaggerations. Pilots lived in a narrow corridor where error was measured in heartbeats. They gauged altitude by instinct, by how the wind felt, how the engine vibrated, how the landscape blurred around them. Instruments helped, but instinct was faster. A pilot could sense when the aircraft was sitting too high in a valley by the way the shadows changed, or when it was too low by how the sound bounced back from the ground. These were intangible skills learned only by doing, and doing meant risking everything. One pilot described it best. At low level, you don't fly the aircraft. You wear it. This was true in combat, just as much as in transit flights. When aircraft approached enemy territory, the tension in the cockpit shifted. Crews leaned forward, as if physically pulling the plane closer to the ground. Navigators switched from relaxed scanning to laser focus. Bomb aimers steadied themselves against the rise and fall of terrain. Radio operators clamped down on the urge to speak. Even the gunners, who often had the loosest role during transit, braced themselves against the possibility of surprise fighters coming from behind a hill or from a barn roof hidden by trees. Some missions were so low that pilots reported seeing German soldiers' faces turn upward in shock. Not silhouettes, faces. The shape of a jaw, the streak of mud on a helmet, the momentary confusion frozen between surprise and fear. Pilots rarely had time to register expressions, but they remembered them anyway. Human contact in the middle of speed and danger left an imprint, a reminder that the war was fought by people on both sides, not just machines. But that brief contact also made the pilots more determined. Seeing the enemy up close reminded them of the stakes. Every mission had a purpose, a power station to knock out, a bridge to collapse, a rail line to sever. Low-level missions weren't random. They were precise, strategic, and aimed at breaking the enemy's ability to fight. Knock out one rail link, and you stopped an entire Army Corps from reaching the front. Disable one communications hub, and you blinded a whole district. The RAF understood the power of a scalpel where a hammer was too slow. The Germans quickly learned that low-level raids, even spotters, had trouble differentiating friendly from enemy at such low heights until it was too late. And by the time flak opened up, the aircraft were already past the defensive perimeter. Some installations were hit before their alarms even finished sounding. This unpredictability drove the Germans to frustration. Reports from soldiers stationed along the coast described the same pattern. A sudden roar, a flash of gray or green, the blink of a cockpit, and then a series of explosions that shattered whatever facility they had been guarding. In many cases, the anti-aircraft crew had barely reached their guns before the aircraft vanished. One German commander wrote in his report that the Mosquito pilots appeared from the earth like ghosts. Another described them as impossible to track, impossible to hit, impossible to anticipate. That wasn't hyperbole. Low-level attacks forced the Germans to think in 3 dimensions. Instead of a flat map showing where bombers approached a high altitude, they had to imagine threats weaving through hills, hugging rivers, and darting across fields at impossible speeds. This broke their defensive rhythm. It created gaps between radar, visual spotters, and gun batteries. Gaps the RAF exploited mercilessly. Some missions became legends even before the crews landed. One Mosquito flight used a railway line as its guide, flying so low the wheels nearly brushed the gravel between the ties. Another crew slipped under a bridge. Yes, under, because a German flak battery was positioned on top of it. The pilot had a fraction of a second to commit to the maneuver. He dipped, leveled, and roared into the shadow under the structure, leaving the gunners momentarily frozen in disbelief. Another famous incident involved a pair of Typhoons tasked with neutralizing a convoy. They came in low through a tree line, burst into a clearing, and found themselves almost eye level with a German officer standing on a half-track. The Typhoon pilot later said he had time to think, "He's close enough to throw a rock at me," before squeezing the trigger and shredding the entire column with cannon fire. These stories spread through RAF stations like folklore, reinforcing both the danger and the effectiveness of low-level flight. They also shaped training. Younger pilots absorbed these tales like scripture. They learned from the mistakes and triumphs of others and internalized the mentality. The lower you go, the harder you are to hit. The faster you go, the less time the enemy has to react. Precision isn't a luxury, it's survival. But low-level flying had another consequence, one often overlooked. It changed how pilots saw occupied Europe. At altitude, everything looked abstract, clouds, patterns, lights. But at low level, pilots saw lives. They saw farmers diving for cover, children running across fields, women hanging laundry, civilians stepping out of shops. They saw fear, confusion, anger, hope, and sometimes they saw the worst, collaborators firing rifles upward or pointing out aircraft to German patrols. This closeness added emotional weight to missions. Crews knew their bombs were precise, but they also knew precision had limits. A fraction of a second early, a tiny deviation in angle, and a bomb could land in the wrong courtyard, the wrong street, the wrong building. Low-level flying heightened the awareness of consequence. Yet despite that burden, the missions continued because the stakes were too high to stop. Resistance groups begged for certain targets to be eliminated. Gestapo headquarters, prisons holding key resistance leaders, communications hubs that linked entire networks of repression. Low-level attacks were the only viable option for saving hundreds of lives in a single morning. One RAF crew flying over Denmark watched resistance fighters wave from a rooftop before ducking back inside to mark a target. The Mosquito pilot dipped his wings in acknowledgement. A silent pact made at 250 miles per hour. Moments later, he destroyed the headquarters of the local Gestapo without hitting the houses beside it. That raid saved over 100 prisoners scheduled for execution within days. On another mission, a flight of aircraft hit a prison wall so precisely that resistance fighters inside were able to escape through the exact breach the pilots had created. Low-level flight wasn't just destruction, it was liberation. As the war dragged on, crews accumulated stripes and scars. Some survived years of missions. Others didn't survive their first week. The cockpit became a second home where pilots aged faster than their years, learning patience, instinct, and acceptance. Many of them didn't live long enough to realize they were rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. They just followed orders, trusted training, and kept flying low because it was what the mission demanded. To the Germans, these pilots looked reckless, almost suicidal. But that was the misunderstanding. RAF low-level flyers weren't reckless. They were precise, strategic, calculated. They understood the land like painters understand light. They knew every danger, every risk, every sound the aircraft made when it dipped too far. And still they chose to fly low because the alternative, flying high, was more deadly. By the final years of the war, German intelligence reports acknowledged something that had been clear for months. Low-level attackers were the hardest to stop, the hardest to predict, and the most demoralizing to face. And for the pilots, the faces they saw on the ground, the shock, the fear, the recognition, became symbols of everything they were fighting to end. The deeper the Allies pushed into occupied territory, the more urgently low-level flying became the cutting edge of the air war. Every mile east brought thicker defenses, faster German response times, and targets packed tighter into cities, valleys, and industrial belts protected by layers of radar and flak. High-altitude raids still mattered. They smashed large factories, fuel depots, and rail yards, but they couldn't hit everything. There were missions where altitude was a liability, not a shield. Missions requiring a pilot to slip into the enemy's chest and strike at the heart before the body even realized it had been wounded. Those missions fell to the men flying 50 feet above the ground. Crews began to know Europe not as a collection of nations, but as a living terrain with moods, rhythms, and traps. They could identify regions by smell when the wind blew through broken windows, the salt along the French coast, the oil-soaked air around German rail yards, the smoke drifting over Belgian forests. They knew which valleys created sudden updrafts, and which fields hid concealed flak guns that farmers pretended were haystacks. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, forest lines gave way to sharp, exposed plains where low flight felt like crossing a lit stage. In the Netherlands, every canal and dike became a mirror that distorted altitude and depth. The land complicated flight as much as the enemy did. The Germans added new tricks to make the landscape hostile. They set up decoy villages, fake rail yards, fake factories, entire miniature towns made of wood and canvas, hoping to lure low flyers into premature bomb drops. Some crews fell for them early in the war, but the most experienced pilots learned to read the difference. Real factories had heat signatures visible as faint waves rising in early morning light. Real trains reflected sunlight differently than painted boards. Real windows showed depth when banks of aircraft passed beside them. Crews adapted. Deception became just another obstacle to analyze at 300 miles per hour. But none of the decoys could stop the most iconic low-level missions, the ones that became whispers in German barracks long before Allies confirmed them. One such mission was a strike on a Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, an operation so precise it defied belief. The RAF used Mosquitoes. Naturally, they thundered over suburbs, dipped between school buildings, and came in over treetops so low they could see bicycles abandoned in the street. Bomb aimers could count windows on the target building. The bombs hit the exact corner needed to open the structure like a box. Prisoners inside, resistance members scheduled for execution, escaped during the confusion. Germans on the ground were stunned. How could bombers hit a single building surrounded by civilians without flattening the entire block? How could they thread through one of Europe's densest cities without clipping a spire? How could they vanish again before anti-aircraft gunners even reached their positions? The answer always returned to the same core truth. Speed plus precision plus altitude equals shock. Low-level flying collapsed defenses faster than any other tool in the Allied arsenal. And the Mosquitoes weren't the only ones rewriting the rulebook. Typhoons, specialized in strafing runs so aggressive German tank crews said they could feel the vibrations through their hulls. A Typhoon attack didn't sound like engines. It sounded like tearing metal, ripping the sky apart. Pilots fired rockets into armored columns from angles so low the exhaust scorched treetops. One Typhoon ace later said, "If I could see a man's helmet, I knew I was flying the right height." P-47 Thunderbolts joined the doctrine too, especially after D-Day. Their rugged frames and monstrous engines were perfect for low-altitude slashing attacks. They dove into rail yards, tore through truck convoys, and could soak up flak that would have shredded thinner aircraft. They were flying anvils with teeth. P-51 Mustangs, built for long-range escort, found themselves pulled into low-level missions as well when the front lines needed speed and reach. Mustangs could slash across France, dip low enough to blow shingles off rooftops, hit a target, and climb out before German radio networks knew what had happened. Every aircraft type brought its own personality to the treetops. Mosquitoes were scalpels. Typhoons were sledgehammers. P-47s were bulldozers. Mustangs were fangs. And still, even with all this variety, the doctrine tied them together with one principle: keep below the enemy systems. Beneath the radar, beneath the searchlights, beneath the 88s, beneath the fighter patrols. Pilots said flying low felt like diving under a wave, dangerous, but survivable if you understood water. At altitude, war was a storm. Down low, it was a control burn. But the Germans learned to adapt. They positioned more light flak on flat trucks that could be moved to wherever RAF aircraft were striking most often. They scattered anti-aircraft guns along valley floors, hidden under nets. They trained infantry to fire rifles and machine guns at low flyers, not in hopes of downing them, but to disturb their approach and force mistakes. They placed balloons with steel cables across known routes. Flying into one of those wires at 300 miles per hour could shear off a wing or tear an engine open like paper. The RAF had to evolve again. Crews memorized balloon locations from intelligence reports. They learned to spot flak traps, areas where the ground looked too perfect, too sculpted, too flat. They refined routes until they became muscle memory. They flew at tree level at dawn to use low light glare as cover. At night, they dropped to blacked-out altitudes where even their shadows disappeared. Each new German countermeasure sharpened British tactics further. It was a duel played out at impossible speed across an entire continent. Every bold idea from one side forced an even bolder response from the other. And then the Allies launched one of the most daring concepts of the war, the pinpoint decapitation strike. A single building, a single office, a single time of day, a single target. To hit it, aircraft had to arrive within seconds of the planned moment. They had to hit from angles radar couldn't anticipate. They had to deliver a blow precise enough to remove only what mattered. Low-level flying turned these missions from theory into reality. There are countless examples, but one stands out: a raid on a Dutch building containing Gestapo files. The aim was to destroy the documents without killing civilians. Mosquitoes came screaming in between rooftops, fired on a specific floor, and pulled away so abruptly that people on the street thought the planes had crashed. Those documents, records of resistance contacts, were incinerated in seconds. Hundreds lived because of that single control strike. Precision wasn't just a tactic. It was a lifeline. Still, every mission carried cost. Some crews never returned. Valleys hit flak that tore engines apart. Wires nearly invisible in poor light cut through wings. Pilots misjudged a ridge by 2 feet. Darkness stole the horizon. A gust of wind shoved an aircraft a meter too far left or right. Many of the men who became experts in low-level flying paid for that mastery with strain no one else could understand. Years later, surviving pilots admitted the truth. You never relaxed at low level. You never unclenched your jaw. You never felt safe. You just trusted the craft, trusted the crew, and trusted the knowledge that every second mattered. And the Germans kept watching them flash by. Fast, close, human. That closeness, that shocking intimacy, stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Low-level missions bled into one another as the war accelerated, each one leaving an imprint on the crews who survived them. Pilots began recognizing certain villages in France and the Low Countries not from maps, but from the flash of a particular church spire or the curve of a riverbank they'd skimmed dozens of feet above at full throttle. Some joked they knew parts of occupied Europe better than their own hometowns. Others didn't joke at all. They simply stared at the ground on each approach like they were visiting a place they'd nearly died before. The Germans felt that familiarity too. Reports from anti-aircraft crews repeatedly mentioned seeing the same type of aircraft approaching by the same valley, as though the RAF were ghosts following trails no one else could see. In reality, the RAF stuck to certain routes because they were the safest combinations of terrain and distance. Not safe by normal standards, only safe compared to flying into layered flak corridors or radar traps. Pilots memorized these paths so deeply that a valley bend or a barn roof became like the lines on their palms. Yet no matter how familiar a route became, no two missions felt the same. The land changed with the seasons. In summer, fields reflected light differently. Rivers shimmered more brightly in the morning. Trees were dense and unpredictable. A sudden gust of wind along a forest edge could shift altitude by a dangerous margin. In winter, the problem reversed. Snow blurred all contrast. Hills looked flatter. Depth perception collapsed. The horizon disappeared in white haze. Pilots learned to judge altitude by how fast trees rushed past, or by the faint ripple of wind over flat meadows. Weather wasn't inconvenience. It was the difference between life and death. Rain hammered windscreens, creating a jittering, distorted view of the world at exactly the moment pilots needed clarity. The engine's roar mixed with the hiss of water. Flying low in rain meant committing to instinct rather than sight. Pilots had to read micro-cues. The shape of a hedgerow, the movement of branches, the softness of a field that told them how close they were to the ground. Thunderstorms bent aircraft like toys. Lightning flashed so bright that crews saw the inside of their cockpits like a strobe. Yet they kept going, not because they were reckless, but because the mission demanded precision, and precision demanded proximity. This proximity extended beyond the physical terrain. It forced crews to see the war in a way high-altitude flyers never experienced. From 20,000 feet up, Europe was abstract. Lines on a map, clusters of lights, thin rivers threading through grids. From 50 feet, it was intimate. You saw a farmer's boots as he sprinted for cover. You saw laundry freeze in midair as a housewife dove behind a wall. You saw German troops scatter like startled birds, rifles in hand, faces tilted upward in disbelief. You saw the world not as patches of color, but as lives interrupted by the scream of Merlin or Griffin or Sabre engines. That closeness produced a strange duality. Pilots became hardened and humanized at the same time. They knew exactly what a bomb could do to a building because they watched the blast unfold from low altitude. Flames licking upward, dust boiling out of windows, debris chasing the tail of their aircraft as they pulled away. They also knew when their bombs saved lives instead of taking them. A precise hit on a communications center stalled a German sweep that would have crushed a local resistance network. A single pass over a rail line delayed reinforcements long enough to change the outcome of a ground battle miles away. The Germans understood this too. Low-level strikes weren't just attacks. They were messages carved into the air. Resistance groups read those messages and knew the Allies hadn't abandoned them. Civilians recognized the unique howl of a mosquito and whispered with awe about the crews who dared to fly so low. German soldiers, on the other hand, felt something entirely different: dread. They were facing a type of warfare designed to bypass their strongest defenses and strike where they were weakest. German radar operators hated low flyers. Their screens couldn't distinguish aircraft hugging the terrain from the terrain itself. German flak crews hated them even more. A typical 88 mm battery was practically useless against aircraft under 100 feet. By the time a gunner spotted the enemy, the aircraft was already on its attack pass or disappearing behind a tree line. Even infantry firing rifles upward had little chance. Bullets lost velocity quickly. Ricochets were unpredictable, and by the time soldiers raised their weapons, the aircraft had passed. The frustration was palpable in German reports. One officer wrote, "They come like shadows sliding across the ground. Our guns are too slow, our eyes too late." That's exactly what RAF tacticians wanted. But the danger never disappeared. If anything, it intensified. As the Germans adapted, low-level flying became a knife-edge discipline. Pilots could no longer rely on a single valley or river route. They had to alternate paths, cut new corridors, take unfamiliar terrain on intuition alone. Missions that once felt methodical began to feel improvisational. Experienced pilots became maestros at reading the land, turning each contour into either cover or a trap. Fatigue made this harder. Men flying multiple missions a week developed responses that lived in muscle rather than thought. Their hands adjusted throttle before their minds registered a ridge. Their feet pushed rudder instinctively. Their eyes scanned the horizon without consciously choosing where to look. Pilots often came back from missions with almost no memory of the hardest parts. The brain simply shielded itself from the most dangerous moments. Crew relationships became a lifeline. Navigators learned to trust pilots implicitly. Pilots relied on navigators to read terrain like prophets. Gunners knew exactly when a pilot was about to bank hard, bracing themselves against the bulkheads. Radio operators learned to filter the noise of wind and engine for the faintest distress call or approaching enemy aircraft. A well-tuned crew could move as a single creature, every muscle and instrument aligned to the same purpose. There are recordings and diaries from RAF crews describing a strange phenomenon: absolute silence inside the cockpit during the most dangerous seconds. Not because of discipline, but because everyone inside was thinking the same thought at the same time. All senses pointed outward, all minds locked onto survival. Then came the escape. After dropping their bombs, pilots often faced the most intense moments of the mission. Escaping at low level meant outrunning the shockwave of their own explosions. Some crews reported the blast lifting their aircraft from behind. Others described debris slamming into tailplanes or bouncing off fuselages. Timing became a rhythm etched into muscle memory. Bomb release, pull up by inches, throttle forward, bank left, drop altitude again to avoid searching guns, then dart through a gap in the terrain. If a German fighter spotted them at that moment, the dogfight became a blur of speed and instinct. Low-level dogfights were unlike anything in the textbook. They happened too fast for long-term planning. One mistake meant eating dirt. Pilots evaded by weaving through tree leans, diving behind hills, or skimming rivers so low their wheels misted water. German fighters sometimes refused to follow, terrified of being dragged into terrain they didn't know. The RAF pilots didn't always escape unscathed. Many limped home with holes in their wings, leaking fuel, smoking engines. Some flew with control surfaces half shredded. Some returned missing bomb bay doors, torn off by overpressure. Ground crews sometimes stared in disbelief at returning aircraft that looked ready to fall apart the moment they rolled onto the runway. But they kept flying, because missions were waiting. Targets multiplied by the week. The front shifted, timetables shrank, and the war demanded speed at a scale no one had envisioned before 1940. By 1944, low-level flying had become a blend of art and science, equal parts madness and mastery. Pilots flew so low through enemy territory that spies and resistance fighters could identify aircraft types by the sound alone. In some villages, locals began marking windows with chalk symbols to warn pilots of cables, towers, or enemy gun placements. These markings weren't official. They were acts of courage from civilians who risked execution if caught. But pilots remembered them. Some said that, during missions, they scanned rooftops for signs that friendly hands had left behind: a white cross on a chimney, a piece of cloth tied to an antenna, a lantern flickering in a barn window. The war became a conversation between sky and ground, coded, whispered, risky. Some of the most dangerous missions weren't the ones with heavy defenses, but the ones with unpredictable weather. Fog rolling in from rivers, sudden downdrafts near mountain ranges, glimmers of wet roads that tricked aircraft into dropping too low. Pilots learned to judge dew, shadow, and the direction of cattle in fields to estimate wind. They knew which factories created smoke patterns that hid flak guns, and which forests funneled sound in ways that revealed or concealed their approach. It was an evolving skill, the kind passed only through experience or tragedy.